welcome once again to The Open Mic, Writers in Their Own Words, the show where every episode I talk to writers, editors, agents, and others in the publishing game to learn a little bit about them and the work that they do. And also, hopefully, I should say, to pass along some tasty tidbits for those of you who are thinking about getting into this crazy business yourself. The show is available by the same name on both YouTube and by all of the major podcast platforms. You can subscribe to either or to both so that you never miss a thing, or you can easily pass it along to someone else, which I hope you do. Telling other people about the show is probably the best way to make sure people know about it. So if you have a friend who's interested in writing or publishing, this would be a good thing, I think, for you to pass along to them. I am, of course, your host, Rich Eisen. My guest today can legitimately be called one of the true legends of the Los Angeles writing scene. Gary Phillips has written almost 20 crime fiction novels, a baker's dozen of graphic novels, numerous short stories and collections, and he's edited or co-edited scores of other anthologies. His latest novel, which I'm going to hold up right here, Ash, Dark as Night. So if you're on the YouTube channel, you get the added bonus of seeing what we're talking about here. It just came out in April. It's the second in the Harry Ingram series. I'm reading it right now, and it is fantastic. He's here with me today to talk about the new book, as well as his other work and anything else I can wrangle out of him about writing and beyond. So, Gary Phillips, it's a real honor. Welcome to the Open Mic.
Rich, thanks so much for having me.
Oh, man, the pleasure is definitely all mine. Well, like I say, let's talk about the new book, Ash, Dark as Night. I'm going to hold it up one more time for the folks on the visual side. As I said in my intro, I'm reading it now. I'm really loving it. For folks who are just becoming aware of it right now, tell us a little bit about it.
Well, as you mentioned, Rich, it's the sequel to One Shot Harry. One Shot Harry was set in 1963 in Los Angeles. This book is set in 1965, so we skip ahead about a year and a half, I suppose. And but in particular, or very specifically to this book, we start smack dab in the middle of the Watts riots. And Harry Ingram, who was a crime photographer, part-time crime photographer and part-time sort of, sometimes a process server, but now becoming more of a bootleg private eye, is out taking pictures as the riot unfolds, and he's in the thick of it. And as things happen, he captures a very specific photograph that the LAPD does not want to see printed, and they think they have confiscated the film from him. But Harry's used to being jacked up by the cops, so he always tries to fake them out, giving them a blank roll or something. And in this case, he's done that, but he's now hidden the film. The film is hidden kind of at the riot scene or part of the riot scene. And but he gets beat down by the cops, and he enlists, or she actually volunteers the aid of his intrepid girlfriend, who's not his girl Friday. I mean, she certainly has her own arc, or at least I try to establish her own arc in these books. But she's down for the cause, and she goes back in to retrieve the film.
Yeah, I mean, you jump right into it, and it's a great lesson for anybody who wants to write. Jumping in right in the middle of action is a great way to kick off a book because it pulls people in, and this one definitely does. I got more questions about that, but you noted it's the second Harry Ingram book. For anyone who's getting into this a little bit, did you always plan for Harry Ingram to have a series, and if so, will we see more Harry Ingram books before you are done here?
Well, I think I always knew. Even when I was writing the first book, even when Soho Crime okayed or bought the book based on an outline that I provided to them, I always knew that I always figured the second book would get done only because I knew I was going to cover Watts. I just knew, it's just such a epic time and period in Los Angeles that there was no way to avoid that. Now, as it happens, they've already asked me for a book 3, which I'm very happy about. Although I've taken a break, I'm actually now writing a heist novel that I'm finishing, and then I get back. Then I'm going to do a Harry novella, and then we're going to get to the full blown Harry. And I'm thinking I might skip ahead to the early 70s Uh, partly, partly I think because I'm also kind of fascinated with, and maybe I'm centering these around very specific events that happened in LA. Because in the '63 book, in the first book, it's Martin Luther King, which actually did happen, has come back to LA. This is 4 months before the March on Washington. Now we have the Watts riots, and then in '72 at the Coliseum, which still exists here, the kind of the football stadium here in Los Angeles. There was a thing called Watts Stacks, which was kind of like that. I guess it's sort of the black version of the big hippie thing.
Woodstock,
the big hippie, the big hippie thing, Woodstock. But it was also about trying to bring peace and unity and kind of revitalizing or suggesting the revitalizing of LA. So that happens in '72. So I'm thinking maybe I might jump ahead again a couple more years. And we started in '72, and Harry, of course, will be covering Watts Stacks as a photojournalist. But then, of course, something else is going to have to happen to kick in the gear, the mystery part.
I really like that. I like having fictional events that you can peg to something that's also, a real event. I'm a reporter. I've been a reporter for 3 decades, so I'm very ensconced in these things, and so I love that. Actually, I really do. It's one of the things that, again, as soon as when I first encountered the book, I said, "Oh, I have to have that," right? But it's also challenging when you're doing that because there's so much emotion around events like what you're talking about, especially the Watts riots. Or I was going to ask you a little later about your 1994 debut novel, Violent Spring, which was set in the aftermath of the 1992 Rodney King riots, which a lot of us remember quite well.
Yes.
And if anyone doesn't remember that, all I can say is Google is a wonderful thing. Look it up. But, the basic is, Rodney King, unarmed, motorist black man who was beaten viciously by 4 cops who then were all acquitted.
It was actually even more than 4 cops. Those are the 4 cops who kind of stood in for the others. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I remember seeing that video. Like, it's like so many people seeing it for the first time and just being absolutely stunned when you're watching it. And I lived in LA, right? I mean, we knew long before that. Even as somebody who is not a person of color, you didn't mess with the LAPD. You didn't cross the sheriff. So if you got pulled over, I mean, even as a white guy in West LA, I was right if you ever got pulled over. That's serious stuff. But my point being, I guess, before I start rambling off there is, when you talk about these kinds of settings, LA is such a character unto itself. We talk about this a lot in books, right? LA, Chicago, New Orleans, New York, they're so often, but LA, to me, more than anywhere, is not a singular thing. There are so many LAs.
That's right.
There are so many parts of LA. You literally can cross a street sometimes and you are in a completely different environment than you were in 5 minutes ago. So I guess, if you don't mind, tell me a little bit about your perspectives on LA as a character and how it informs or impacts the kinds of stories that you like to tell.
Well, I think, Rich, that's a great point. I think also that lends itself or a dovetail so well into why it is. I mean, one, of course, I'm a mystery fan and a mystery reader, but why it is that I think the mystery format, and particularly a character like Harry, or maybe one of my other characters who are licensed PIs, why it is that we're fascinated by those characters. One, of course, just because who they are and how they react to their situations, and the people they get to interact with. But the idea that I think, particularly for Harry, in a changing city, right? So when we start in '63, LA is a segregated, officially segregated community. You have a police chief, Chief Parker, who, by the way, is still the police chief in the second book when the Watts riots happened. But Parker was actively recruiting white officers from the Jim Crow South to come to LA to essentially keep the natives down. And so, so you have these elements, you have this kind of structure, and then yet still here's a kind of freedom, because LA was always about the automobile, and in fact the freeway, the Santa Monica freeway, the Interstate 10 is getting finished in the first book, as it ends at the sea, it ends at the ocean. And so you do have freeways, you have streets where you take them and you go here and there, and as you said, you're in this other neighborhood, or you're in this other enclave. Now, it is the case that Harry has to be keenly aware of where he's driving. I mean, there's a mention. I don't think it's a mention so much in the second book at Ash, but there's certainly a mention in the first book. Oh, that's not true. There's a mention in the second book as well. This whole question of like the sundown town, right? That Glendale or Maywood, which was just to the east of South Central, across Alameda, are towns where if you're black, you certainly you might have some business there during the day, but come sundown, you better not catch yourself there. You better be back on your side of town. At least the police or anybody else should stop you. So the idea that on one hand, I want to portray these enclaves, I want to give you some sense of the sprawl, and the other hand, I want to also then, to some extent, make you aware that Harry is aware that as he travels about, he clearly has to be cognizant of his surroundings.
It's interesting. I've seen some writers in the culinary world, cookbook authors, lately getting having the perspective that, especially if they're writing about a cultural cookbook, let's say, a few authors who write books with African, South African recipes, or Central American, being of the mind that, look, if I put out an ingredient or something that's not normal to an American grocery store, it's not imperative on me to tell you what that is or how to find a comparison to it. And to some extent, I understand that, right? They're saying, look, again, Google it. You can figure it out yourself, right? Get some skin in the game, so to speak, here, and figure out if you really want to do this. I've always thought, well, yeah, but do you want people to buy your book? Right? It's to me, I understand where they might be coming from as a quote unquote artist, but as a business person, I think I'm not sure that's the best path. How does that work for you? Because you're not a historian, you're not someone who's trying to. You're telling a story of fiction, but it is set in these very real times, and these were very real conditions. And as we've seen in the last few years, whether it's George Floyd or Philando Castile, and you go on, right? The list goes on and on. These are not situations in some cases that have changed that much, right? Mm-hmm. So do you feel some imperative to try to also educate a little bit with how you tell these stories, or are you just you fall down on the entertainment side of it all?
Yeah, I think in the end, I'm trying to fuse both of those elements, but in the end, I understand that I'm providing. Hopefully, I'm providing an entertainment. Now, hopefully, I'm providing entertainment that might be distinct from others, and it might be grounded in a kind of infusion of certain realities, but that in the end, it's still about the character and characters illuminating themselves, and also then, of course, in the end, illuminating the plot. So I'm always trying to work all those different elements, but for sure, Rich, as you well know, when you delve into any subject, and we can go down the rabbit holes of all kinds of research and tributaries. You can't put all that on the page. It's just leaden. It'll just be an info dump. It'll just be you standing there on a soapbox, and that's not my job. Well, maybe it is my job in some other form, but it ain't my job when I'm writing a mystery novel or a crime fiction novel. I'm hopefully telling you a story. I'm telling you a story that I would want to read. So hopefully a few folks out there might want to read it, and hopefully I'm giving you some characters. Whatever you think of those characters, that you want to stay with, and want to see what happens to them and what happens to whatever the situations are that they find themselves embroiled in. But yeah, I think in the end, I can't ignore certain realities because it's just the nature of how I grew up and my background or whatever. But having said that, it's also the case that I want to kind of keep moving along, and I want to still be able to hopefully give you that the situation and that the world that these characters live in, yes, has an effect on these characters, but that they still nonetheless are going to be put in motion.
You know, you have a few other previous series that have been pretty successful. How is Harry Ingram different from the main characters in those series? I'm thinking, of course, of Ivan Monk and the Cheney. And obviously, I realize Martha's a woman. But, in terms of the characteristics, as characters, the elements of their personalities and the things that makes them interesting, how did you go about creating them and making them different?
Well, right. So that, to a certain extent, they're kind of staking out these different eras of time. So there's that, right? So Harry's sort of firmly in the 60s and 70s. Maybe he'll make it to the 90s where we last left Mr. Monk. And one of these days when I get back to him, I suspect I'll have to still go back to the 90s because it's like that thing that when Mickey Spillane started writing Mike Hammer, they were more or less the same age, and then of course Mickey got older, and then Mike Hammer couldn't, or when Robert Parker was writing Spencer, it was the same thing, right? At some point. And I remember this very specifically. At some point, like Harry, Spencer was a Korean War vet. Then at some other point, he became a Vietnam War vet. And even further down the line, he just became a vet. So having said that, I'm aware that if I go back to Monk, I'm going to capture Monk back in the 90s as opposed to Monk being an old man now. Well, maybe at some point we'll look at that too. But anyway, all that to say that so there's a certain to a certain way they get defined, and then Martha, who's younger than both these guys, is an ex-showgirl, but she's kind of in the world of modern Las Vegas or whatever Vegas is now, I suppose. And so that's to say is that to a certain extent, these folks are defined by place and time. Harry is a Korean War vet. Monk, I make a mention that he didn't go to Vietnam, but that he had been just slightly younger to be that his number that it is like with me. I had to register for the draft, and in those days, I remember specifically as a senior in high school, we would get the LA Times, because I think on Thursdays at that point there was a lottery system, so you would look to see where your number was in the lottery system. And so he doesn't go to Vietnam, and then Martha doesn't go to any. Is not a vet of anything, at least not a vet of organized campaigns. So they are defined somewhat by where they are in time, what their situation is, or what is the world in which they exist, and then of course, then in the end, then it's also still about how do you infuse each one of them with a kind of different backstory. Who is their family? Where do they come from? In Harry's case, we get a slight glimpse of his backstory. We know a little bit about his mother. We know that his father left early on. We know that the guys in the opening scene in One Shot, those same guys show up here in Ash Darkest Night. But those are his buddies. There's another vet in the story who was blinded in the war by a landmine. And so these help to who your friends are, right? And how do you relate to them, and the dialogue you have with them, and the things that are said and unsaid, are at least ways in which I find my way into the characters as a way to then define them and make them one from the other. And certainly in Harry's case, because he is a vet, and he is not really escaping his past, but he is haunted by more than one incident from that war that I talk about, as well as why is it that he thinks about these things in both books. Why is it that he does make this living running around capturing sort of people at their worst in stills, in pictures? And what is it about him that what is it that he's actually looking for that he's not quite sure he can find? And maybe that is also partly, and I suggest this in Ash, that is partly the reason why he then is somewhat eager when this idea of finding this missing person to kind of function as a real private eye appeals to him as a way to, I think, on one hand, keep investigating the human condition, but on the other hand, I don't have to necessarily put it on film. Although, of course, the picture that he takes in the book does give him a certain kind of infamy, which he's not necessarily happy about.
Right. Well, I was going to ask this later, but that actually leads better into this. So, it would be, I think, somewhat easy to see your writing in these stories as having a political bent to them. Do you see it that way?
Yeah, I think certainly there's, I suppose to some extent it comes through, but, again, Rich, I've become certainly much more, maybe wary is even the word, that I don't want to, like I said, I don't want to be on a soapbox. I don't want to be riding that high horse, and that I think I can have more fun with the characters, so that, yes, Harry has a certain outlook, but he certainly is not, he's not as to the left as his girlfriend is. I mean, as Anita Claire is, and given her background, her folks being lefties and fellow travelers and all this sort of stuff, and it kind of rubbed off on her. And so to a certain extent, his purview about life, or how he examines it, through what lens do we interpret these events, it has changed or has shifted given the influence Anita Claire has had on him. And so, but in the end, I think, so that's part of it, that you clearly want characters that are delineated one from the other. They can't all be singing the same tune, because otherwise that's pretty damn boring. So I think as long as I can kind of keep those dynamics going, and make Harry more of a, I don't know, I guess Harry is more of a pragmatist. I guess Harry is much more of his feet planted firmly on the ground. I think as long as I can keep him that way, I think then there's something to explore, there's something to write about. Because otherwise, if in the end he's just in sync with his old lady, then, which is fine. I mean, you can have that. I just don't think that's the dynamic I'm looking for.
Well, the situation that he's in are, telling unto themselves, and how he handles it. Like you say, you can really differentiate how he handles it from how someone else handles it. And to me, that's fascinating, because every good protagonist is conflicted, right? That's the thing. They're conflicted by the things that have happened in their past. And I think it's one of the things that always makes combat veterans interesting, because they have a perspective that thankfully a very small percentage of the world has. And, you hear it all the time. It's a cliche in some ways. I've clearly never been in combat, but once you have, you don't see the world the same anymore.
Yeah.
And so I find that actually quite fascinating, quite interesting. One more question on the somewhat political front, because I think I love this in your history. I wanted to ask you about a book that you edited. It's a book of short stories called The Obama Inheritance, which takes on some of the truly insane, bizarre conspiracy theories perpetrated by the folks who seem to be most disturbed by Barack Obama becoming president. Because there was a Washington Post review that called that book, and I'm quoting here, cheerfully strange and purposely bizarre. And I love that. So I just have to ask, and the roster of writers that contributed to that was great.
Yeah.
How was that experience for you? Because it sounds like a lot of fun to me, but was it fun?
It was fun. It was The Obama Inheritance, 15 Stories of Conspiracy Noir. And I was so happy Peter Kaloftis and Kat Georges at Three Rooms Press agreed to publish it. In fact, that anthology went on to win an Anthony for best anthology of that year. And really, man, my edict to the writers were just, look, there's all these, these then, God's sakes, even now, right? But anyway, even then, there's all these insane theories about Obama, that he went back in time and he changed, he altered his birth certificate, or he really is part of the Elizabeth, whatever insane conspiracy theory about Obama, just run with it. Write the story, because it is, you can have fun. And I think everybody did. I mean, and to the proof is in the pudding. But I think everybody did just such a wonderful job of having at it and fooling around, with this notion that it just came across. I think it was just, and again, sort of to the point, and it was not preachy. It was not trying to tell you anything. It was just saying, look, have fun with this. These are just whack job theories. But what if what if one of the whack job theories was right, or several of these theories were right? And what would that be like? What would that world be like? So and here it is.
Well, I have to say I have not read it, but I absolutely 100% plan to, because so as I noted, I'm a reporter. I've covered state houses the last 25 years, and I've worked for LexisNexis for a long time. So I was state houses around the country, and I talked with lawmakers all over the country over the course of a very long time. From let me think, who was president? I guess Bush 2 was president.
Okay.
When I started doing this, and then we went through, Obama and Trump and Biden, but so I've heard some of those theories expressed to me seriously.
Yes.
Off the record in conversations. I mean, Obama was a gay prostitute in college. I mean,
yes,
where it took all of my ability as a rational human being to not have the kind of expression that was going to betray what was going on in my head. Because I was thinking, you're an elected official.
Yeah,
he actually voted and made you a representative of the people, and you sound like you're batshit crazy.
Exactly. Yeah.
I don't know what else to say about that.
Yeah.
Anyway, again, I don't care what side of the political aisle you're on. That just is batshit crazy. So, right? You just, Anyway, I had to ask you about that because that just sounded like too much fun for me. So you did a lot of comic books, and I was a big comic book reader as a kid, of all kinds, from the super silly, everything from Casper through the Marvel books and all those things. I'm curious, what were your favorite comic book series as a kid, and how did any of that impact your writing now, if at all?
That's interesting. So then as now, Daredevil was always a favorite of mine. Still remains a favorite of mine. And it's interesting because there's a lot of sort of crime fiction elements fused in the Daredevil books, or a lot of the Daredevil series. Even though, yes, he is this blind superhero with his radar sense, but he's never. I mean, that's his superpower, but he's not. He's just sort of like Batman, kind of the supreme athlete kind of guy, and he's gone through all these various things, and currently I think he's a priest, in fact, now in his civilian identity, just from lawyer to priest. But so Daredevil was always a favorite of mine. Certainly those early days of the Fantastic Four, when Jack Kirby was drawing and plotting the books, and Stan Lee was putting in the dialogue. Those had a big impact on me, just visually, just the stuff, just really, when you stop to think about it, all the just kind of amazing imagery that Kirby had to really grind out, right? On a day-to-day basis, to make a living, let alone that he didn't share in the ownership of the properties that he helped to create. So a lot of that, and then even though early on, and I mentioned this before, or mentioned this in other settings, where I grew up in South Central, you didn't read the DC comics, because in those days DC comics were considered kind of goofy. But there were a couple that I to admit that I did sneak and read, and one of them was Green Lantern, because there was this wonderful artist, Gil Kane, and he was drawing the Green Lantern stories, and the stories weren't all that great, but his artwork was just wonderful, just very lyrical, and he was the opposite of Kirby. Kirby was very, very hugely stylized, and Gil Kane was sort of kind of his characters look like they all belong, on Renaissance paintings, that kind of anatomy and those kind of wonderful poses and stuff. Anyway, all that to say is that all that stuff certainly affected me in the sense of just helping to fuel my imagination, I think, right? And the idea that this is a way to tell a story, and this is a way to convey. And then then as comics start to get a bit more edgier, right? And I suppose that's really in the 70s, I guess. But as the old way gives way to kind of the new edge, and which was reflective, by the way, of some of the young folks coming into comics, and people who had been affected by the civil rights movement, and some of them were vets. Some of those guys had been to Vietnam, and so maybe they were in the anti-war movement when they came back, and so you started to see those sensibilities filter in as more women got involved. So you started to see those sensibilities kind of filter in and change, even though you were still telling superhero stories. Those stories got to start to be kind of shaded and kind of had to start to adapt. Or there was originally, like, for instance, it was like a big deal at the time because the Comics Code, right, I guess was around even through the 70s. You had to have that little seal in the corner of the comic book saying, it had passed certain kind of censorship to be published by one of, at that point, one of the big two, right, Marvel or DC. And I know there was a anti-drug abuse comic, a Spider-Man comic, where a kid dies. Kid dies from an overdose, and they made a big deal because the Comics Code wouldn't approve the book, right? Because it showed drug use and blah blah blah. But at that point, Marvel was on the ascendancy because Marvel had long suffered in the shadow of DC. But then they got to be hip, right? They were getting Stan Lee was getting gigs speaking on college campuses, so they knew. I mean, it's not like Stan would put his neck out for no reason, but he also knew that if we published this particular issue of Spider-Man without the Comics Code, I think, and he was right, that there was going to be enough readership and enough of a backlash, right? That was the thing. We had enough of a backlash that said, oh, therefore we have to have this comic because now the man is saying, you can't read it. So all that, but yeah, all that kind of stuff, man, is infused in my head. And although oddly, I've read a couple of superhero comics, but mostly I wind up just writing, crime fiction comics. But you're right. Invariably, that stuff still leaks into some of my work, whether it's the Harry books where I've written kind of a retro pulp novel with taking a real life character, Matthew Henson, and kind of reimagining him in a pulp hero kind of mold. So all this stuff is always percolating in my head, and it, some way or another, it leaks its way out.
Well, and we were talking before we started recording. It was one of the things I'd like, and I'm going to hold it up one more time about After Dark as Night, is because there's almost a graphic novel feel to the writing, and I mean that in the best possible way because I'm a very visual reader, and it's funny because it's that makes it sound like it's not subtle, but it is. No one's whacking you over the head with it. It's just the way that you do it. It's a real skill.
Right.
In a sentence or two, weave through a paragraph or a page even that gives somebody, a reader, a real visual of what kind of thing they're experiencing. I can see these things happening in my head. And, there's a lot of ways to do that. This is one of them, and it really works. I mean, it's a really interesting style. So but I also know, I read that one of your influences as a kid, and I know you had many, on most of us do, but one of the ones that really stood out to me was Rod Serling and the Twilight Zone. Now, all of us of a certain age remember it either in reruns or I think we're not old enough to remember original run most of them, but I certainly have seen, I think, every single one of them in reruns. And like most of us, I'll go and watch, when they have a Twilight Zone marathon or whatever, I'll watch as many of them as I can. I mean, it's just the most fantastic writing and storytelling. Tell me a little bit about Rod Serling and the Twilight Zone and its impact on you as a writer.
Well, like you said, Richard, I guess TV was my babysitter, but certainly as a kid growing up watching those reruns on Channel 5, and then somewhere in the context of that, around 9 or 10, I got this book from my aunt, and it was a collection of short stories from the Twilight Zone. And they were short stories taken from Serling's teleplays, but put in a prose short story format. And so it was kind of eye-opening to read these stories where all of a sudden, unlike the TV, you were part of the story was inside the character's point of view, right? Inside the character's head. And it wasn't just the dialogue of the character. Now you had some sense of what that character was thinking about or why they said what they said, and why they reacted like they reacted. And it was just, as I said, it kind of altered my reality in the sense of, oh, yes, here's this thing. I mean, as a kid, I didn't say these words, but it was later looking back. Here's this way in which you can now add this dimension to these characters and these situations they find themselves in. That while, yes, no doubt, the visual medium is still the very, is very, having done a little work at TV, the visual medium is just powerful. You can't. There's almost no comparison. But there is. But having said that, then it's also the case that in a book where you have the real estate to explore more psychologically or more even emotionally what the character is thinking or going through, there's something to be said for that. There's something to be why it is that some books are harder to translate to film, et cetera, et cetera. The idea being that, oh, here's the story in one way, and here's the story this other way, and isn't that fascinating? Isn't that interesting? And that I think, again, it was not something I articulated at that age, but it was only later looking back to think about, oh, yes, there are different ways in which one can get into a story and tell the story. And as Serling did, often when he was, was very deft about it, he was both entertaining as well as then gave you a bit of a message. He gave you a bit of something else to think about as the story or as the show went dark and before we go to the next commercial.
Yeah, there was always a twist, right? I think there was so many of the ones where it did not end the way you thought it would, or
right.
It was a whole different perspective, and he was a genius at getting you to think, and you said this yourself, to think about things in a different way.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was absolutely brilliant. So when I saw that you were influenced by him, I thought, oh, that's awesome. We have to talk about that. Now, I've also read in the past where you've said you're really plot driven, and we've been talking lots and lots here about character. Can you maybe take me through just a little bit of your process because I say anyone who's watched this show before has heard me say this. Plotting is the hardest thing that I ever do as a writer. It just kills me sometimes. And the beneficiaries have long been my dogs because when I get stuck, we take a 5-mile walk, right? While I'm wow, what's going on in my head here. So they get lots of 5-mile walks when I'm in the middle of a manuscript, right? But characters I love. I love to try to figure out, how do you do it? Well, because you have such vivid characters, but I've read now, like I say, that you're very, very plot driven. How do you manage that process? What works for you in how you get from A to B?
Yeah. I start, if it's a book, I start with the outline, right? I outline it out. I have some sense of how we're going to get it, from the beginning to the middle to the end. I have some sense of who are the characters I'm going to put on stage and what are they going to be doing. Again, some notion about how how do they relate to each other, whether that's for good or for ill, but what is it they want versus what is it, your other character wants, all the stuff that you kind of think about. And then as I said, there's the overarching thing, the plot that is driving or underneath is driving the story. But as a good example, like I'm in the finishing stages, at least at the draft, of this heist now. And now I'm at the stage where all these characters are anti-heroes. And this is the character I've written about before. And now he's sort of at the stage that he's wounded, this and that, but he's after the badder guy. And this is different than how I imagined the story. I mean, I knew they would always have the kind of showdown, but this is, I'm getting there in a different way than I had imagined, but it has now, at least I think it has now, been an organic way in which I find myself there. So that's really, so the answer really to your question, Rich, is I start with this outline. I use that as my safety to have my blueprint. Invariably, then I'm digressing from it. And then as hopefully I've come along, and these characters now, I have some sense of who the characters are and how they might react, particularly under pressure, right? Because we want our characters under pressure. We want our characters. So in this heist novel, as I'm writing these sort of last passages, I've now backed my character up into a corner a couple of different times and gotten them out of it. At least I think I've effectively gotten them out of it. But again, this helped me then to make the mechanics of the plot work, but also it's helped me then to better define him character-wise. So I think for me, in the end, if both things can happen, right? If the character's momentum is such that we're taking them forward, him or her forward, or them forward, and at the same time we're kind of resolving plot points, that's golden. But like you said, listen, man, that doesn't always happen. and I got choked up just even thinking about it. And that, like, also, as you said, I try to meet my quota. Every day my quota is or working day, because I edit sort of on the weekend, but then the 5 days I write 5 days a week. I write. So 1,200 words, right? So that's like what, five and a half double space pages, right? And right now I didn't make my quota today. I'm like a couple hundred words short, but that's okay, because after this, I'm gonna, like you said, I'm gonna go to the gym, and it actually never comes to me working out. It never really does, but at least I'm doing something else, and I'm kind of, keeping mind and body active. And also, it never comes to me when I'm dreaming. So somehow or another, the solution bubbles up somewhere in there, in between that, right? Between the waking and the dream and the dream state, right before I go to sleep. Oh, that's what I got to do. Right. But you're right. I can't. I know, we're here. There's a perfect point though to the point about plot. I kind of know what I want for the showdown with these two guys. I don't want them just shooting each other. I really want them, down in the mud and, just grinding it out and biting their ears and all this crap. But I don't know that I can get there, right? So if I can't get there, then I'm just going to have to resolve it some other way. I want to get there, and I think maybe I can get there, but I'm not sure. So if it looks too contrived, right? If it looks too artificial, then I have to back off, right? I can't. If I can't make it happen, I can't make it happen. But I'm trying to will it into existence. But as you said, it's like at some point you just gotta. It's not like I've hit the wall, but it's like, okay, I've got to stop. I know now I'm almost at the end of this thing. I know now, kind of how it is. But now I am stuck on how I get there, or the thing I want to do to get there. Maybe I can't do, and maybe that's what it is. That you have to wrestle with it for a couple more days and say, okay, well, yes, I can do that, or no, I can't do that, and now I just have to resolve it this way.
It's so funny to me how often writers get into those situations, and it doesn't matter how long you've been doing it. It always happens, and everyone's got a different method for how to get out of it. But by the grace of whatever powers there be in the universe, somehow that light bulb goes on, and we've all had that feeling where you're like, and you'll be the weirdest way. You'll be at the doctor's office or in traffic, or like I said about walking my dog, or you'll be doing anything, and it's never where you can actually start writing it down.
That's right.
A place where you would be really inappropriate for you to actually bust out a notepad, trying to. So I have total empathy, man. I know there's just like say, there's times I've had that conversation. Oh, I can't do it. This is too much. I screwed myself. I'm gonna have to start this all over. Or ever, I have completely botched this about as bad as can be botched, and it can't be fixed. And then a half hour later, it's like, what are you
Right?
This is how it works. I can do this.
And I can do this. Right. Exactly.
Well, Pulp Fiction has always been derided, or long been. I'm not sure always, but it's often been derided.
Yeah.
Out of a less than, quote unquote, less than another genre fiction, or heaven help us, literary fiction, or what have you. You, though, embrace it. I've seen you talk about this before.
Yeah.
And you readily refer to your work often as pulp, and you take a really interesting approach to that. And I was hoping you'd share that with me here a little bit, because you, like say, you embrace it and you do it really well. And then I guess what we maybe would call modern pulp, but give me a little bit of perspective on that.
Again, Rich, I don't know if again it's these, it is those influences, right? Those early influences. And I think, right. So that, there's ways in which you, what's the word I want? I guess I want to say you kind of leaven, you don't go too far into the purple. You don't go, you know what I mean? And you got just enough, right? Just to give them a little taste, just to take them there, or just to say, okay, I put the character, the pressure's on, right? The big turn screw, the pressure in the steam thing, whatever it is on, and short of them suddenly gaining a superpower or somehow, Deus Ex Machina, it comes down from above. What do we do? And I think always keeping in mind, if it's something questionable, you can't let your character off the hook. Right. So in One Shot Harry, I mean, not to give too much away if people haven't read it, but Harry kills a man in cold blood. Right? And he knows he's doing this. And he knows, doesn't quite know, that this is going to add to his, well, he knows that it adds to his sins, but I suppose he kind of accepts that. Does it cause him psychological damage? Well, probably. There's echoes of it, or he thinks about it in Ash. It comes back to him in Ash. But also the real incident, or the real crime, if you will, from the war. And I don't know that I like to think that my characters are nihilistic. They're not, but maybe they are. Maybe Harry, more than the others, is on some kind of doomed path. I'm not sure. I'm not sure yet. I like to think not, but maybe, I don't know. But I think so that, because really the answer then about pulp, pulp is always about exaggeration. Pulp is about kind of the extremes. And so to a certain extent, I embrace that, as you said, but you can't go, you don't want to go too far, because then it becomes too cartoony and it becomes this other thing. It becomes a pastiche, which is not necessarily what I'm after, not like in the Harry books. Now, maybe when I did the Matthew Gibson thing, sure, I let that, I got Tesla's death ratio, and of course I'm gonna have some fun. But even then, I tried to ground the character in a certain kind of reality, in a certain kind of reaction to that stuff, so that no matter how crazy the situation, I think you get. Yes, that's the answer. Is I write more, and then I cut back and I cut back, and I shade and I shade, and I think that helps me then to give it to you, you the reader, in a kind of fashion and format that doesn't seem like such a huge, like this big glitch all of a sudden in the middle, or where you're reading along and all of a sudden there's this insane thing, and then like, where did that come from? I think if you can lay the groundwork, if you as the writer can get those tracks, you know what I mean, in the kind of way, and you're going to start to veer on those tracks. But as long as we're not necessarily consciously aware of it as the reader, but when you look back and think, oh, okay, I see. This is where we started to make that turn. This is where we started to go down this road. And we took, and I went there willingly with this character. And so now it only makes sense that now the character is up against it, why they do what they do. So that whether it's pulp or it's hard boiled or these other kinds of traditions I'm calling on in writing my stuff, or even to some extent, when I write stories that are, mashup of sci-fi and crime fiction, whatever. But that if I can, as I said, sort of kind of take it to the extreme, and then as well as understanding that I'm going to cut it back and reel it back in somewhat to help them keep the structure intact, the story intact, then I think I've done my job.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I've only got one more serious question, then I don't want to keep you here all day, but I will ask you, so you've done a lot of things in your career aside from writing, which, thankfully the writing thing has worked out, but you've been a community activist, you've been a labor organizer, but I want you to tell me a little bit more about delivering dog cages.
Well, fortunately, that was somewhat short-lived. And it was like this. I was actually working as I've had various stints as a printer, but in those days we printed labels, and printing labels is on pressure sensitive stock, and it's a different way than printing offset on single sheets. Anyway, and it's all done on a web. It's a kind of web press, but they're web presses that are designed to print shampoo labels and this kind of stuff. And each station is a different color, and you put them together. Anyway, all of it to say is that this was like a side business that the owner of the printing business had. And so when times were slow, rather than, I guess God bless him, rather than lay all of his employees, he has his delivering dog cages on his side job, on his side gig. So that was the extent of it. It wasn't long and deep or particularly involved. Unlike Harry and working a couple of different jobs, but it was a way to bide our time until we got more work in as printers.
I love it. Anyone who knows this show knows I'm a real dog person, so you shouldn't be surprised I would ask about anything to do with dogs. So
yeah, I thought I saw a Dalmatian behind you earlier.
Well, actually, these are Llewellyn English setters.
Oh, I see.
Dalmatians because of the spots, but we
gotcha.
can see more clearly. But yeah, they're sweetheart dogs. They're
wow.
That's the one you saw. I think was my older one. That's the one my wife calls the other woman. So that gives you a little bit of a hint as to how they are treated in this.
How they are treated. I got you.
Pretty good.
Right.
Well, I like to end on a fun question. Something I hope is fun. I mean, let's just say I'm the omnipotent person who can put you together with one of these three people for a conversation on anything you want, dinner, drinks, whatever. But I can only put you together with one of them. Which one of these three would you choose? And the options I'm going to give you are the astronaut Guion Bluford, who was the first African-American astronaut.
He's the first African-American astronaut. There was a black astronaut before him, the Cuban guy.
Yes, you are correct.
Yes. Yeah.
Jane Addams, who was a co-founder of the ACLU.
Yeah.
Or for an LA kid like yourself, the late great Rosie Greer, one of the LA Rams' fearsome foursome from back in the day.
That's pretty good. That's a great array of people. Holy smokes, man.
I'm trying to make it a little tough.
Well, it's funny because I've heard Buford talk a couple of times, not in person, but there's a wonderful documentary now about history of sort of blacks in aviation, and he's in that. And all right, so since I've seen him talk, but I guess, you know what? Okay, I guess Jane Addams. Why not? Let's have. I don't know that Jane Addams was much of a steak eater, but let's have steak and vodka martinis, or maybe she might have a vodka stinger. And let's talk. Let's have a conversation. I'll have a conversation with Jane Addams. There we go.
All right, I like that. I love that. I tried to throw you a little curveball with Rosie there.
Yeah.
You played football as a young man, but and he was an interesting cat, man.
He was an interesting cat. He was a knitter, right?
Yeah. He was an interesting cat, man. On so many levels. Well, Gary, this has been fun. I could ask you questions and talk about writing all day long, but I'll let you get on with your day. I really appreciate you coming on the show. I'm going to hold it up one more time for those of you on the YouTube channel.
Thank you, Rich. This was great, man. That was a wonderful conversation. I thought we had. It was really something.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And like I say, folks, Ash Dark as Night, Gary Phillips. If you haven't seen it yet, go check it out. It's really good stuff. So check out all of Gary's work. We'll find the book, the anthologies that he has edited, etc. I mean, a lot of great stuff out there. The man's been doing it a long time, and he's really, really good at it. So go check it out. And he's a good guy, as you can tell. So, really appreciate Gary coming on the show today. It's been fabulous. I enjoyed myself for sure. That's
I'm glad you had me. That's great.
Well, I'll leave you guys with the same thing I leave you with every time, which is, if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe. And if you would be so kind, share news of the show, tell one friend about it, especially if that person might be interested in writing. It's a great way to learn a lot about the craft in a really easy format. So please do help other folks find the show. Leave me a review, leave a 4-star review or a 5-star review. Subscribe. Those things are great. I appreciate it if you do. Thank you so much. I will also say, I guess, the same thing I always say. I always mean it. Tomorrow, it's not promised to any of us. So whatever you do, make today count. For my guest, Gary Phillips, for myself, Rich Eisen, for my 2 crazy dogs behind me, Pippa and Stella, this has been the Open Mic Writers in Their Own Words. We will see you again next time.